Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So today we're going to wrap up chapter 5. And if you've read this chapter in the textbook, you might have noticed that the text goes into a whole lot more detail than you might be finding in the slides. And that's intentional. I find that this section in different textbooks, they either go into way too much detail or not enough at all. And ours went the way too much detail. And I find that it gives you lots of information that's great for memorization type questions where they're asking you to remember which drugs fall into which category and how they're all different. But I find that that's a lot more appropriate for some of the upper level classes that get into more about the functioning of drugs and how it affects our consciousness. So you're going to find that I keep everything at a very sort of lower level of understanding just because I don't like testing that way. So I'm going to focus in on the broad categories and the implications at that level, but I'm going to do a lot less of sort of this particular drug in this particular situation. And even before that, we're going to start very, very briefly talking about hypnosis and then meditation. And these are just two different kinds of alterations of consciousness, which is, again, one of those loose terms that's describing this whole chapter. And so hypnosis is a strange one because there's a lot of sort of misinformation out in the world about what hypnosis is, and then we find that what people think hypnosis is ends up influencing how it affects them. So it's a very psychologically intense topic. But if we wanted to talk about hypnosis, the general term is that it's a systematic procedure that ends up increasing our suggestibility. So it's a way to sort of calm you down and make you more open to suggestions that someone's giving to you. So we have sort of this preconceived notion of what hypnosis is. You've probably seen it in TV or movies where someone stares at a watch that swings back and forth and they're told that they're getting very sleepy. And eventually they sort of drop into a suggestible state where they can be told how to react when certain things happen. And that a lot of it is sort of showmanship and media, but there are ways that hypnosis can be used that's a lot less over the top, I guess we can say. So that process of slowing your mind down and relaxing you is part of induction, where you sort of open up to suggestibility, and that happens not necessarily because of any kind of magic or anything going on in the background. It's just because it's calming and relaxing your body. And we'll find that a lot of the things that are common for hypnosis are also going to carry over into meditation, not because of, again, like something big and fancy going on in the background, but because when we relax, there are different parts of our body that we can seem to have some control over. And so with susceptibility, what a lot of media doesn't portray is the fact that some people tend to be highly suggestible. Some people are almost impervious to hypnosis and this sort of suggestion to relax. And most of the population falls somewhere in the middle. So we have different levels of susceptibility, and it's all going to depend on, so I guess, your preconceived notions as well as something to do with how your brain is set up and how you think about things. But again, this isn't an exact science quite yet. So for some of the neat things that we care about that can be produced through hypnosis, we have things like anesthesia, where they have done entire surgeries on people with no anesthesia simply by using hypnosis to sort of relax their mind and convince them that they're not feeling any pain. And that has worked, and even studies looking at that process will look for pain recognition in the brain, and they don't end up finding any. So somehow we're interrupting that flow of sort of the input of pain signals to our brain. We can also have sensory distortions and hallucinations through hypnosis, where you're sort of hearing or seeing or feeling things that aren't quite there, or maybe slightly modifying what you are seeing. And that again sort of comes down to that suggestibility and sort of believing what something is so that it comes to pass. We'll see a little bit of disinhibition. That's one of the big ones, where people will do things that they wouldn't normally do. Though there are some ideas that people will only go so far with that idea of things that they wouldn't normally do, where you wouldn't do something outside of your own character. If it was something you would morally oppose, you would kind of snap out of it or refuse to interact. Or even things that might harm others. There tends to be a line where people won't cross. And then the big one that you see in movies is post-hypnotic suggestions and amnesia, where they say that if you hear this particular word, you're going to do this particular action, or after we've gone through this, you're going to forget all of these things that happened. And that's, again, not really well supported in the literature. What we think is actually going on here is the fact that, as we've said, people have this ability to sort of make things happen that they think should happen. So like our placebo effect, where if you're given a sugar pill and told it's a pain reliever, it will cause less pain. So you'll have a reduction in your pain because of your expectations. And so there have been a lot of studies on hypnosis where when they explain to the participants what is involved in hypnosis, they can add in extra details or leave things out and find that those participants' behavior while they're hypnotized matches what they were told should happen. So one of the studies that I remember is they were told, or one group was told that while hypnotized, they'd experience a slight tremor in their left hand, and the other group wasn't told this. And like 80% of the group that was told that ended up having a slight tremor in their left hand, and the other group, no one had it. So it's more of that, what we expect to happen seems to be how we behave, within some limits. So it's another one of those sort of gray areas where there's a lot of research and a lot of contradictory research, but it seems to have something to do with expectations, more or less. We can also then look at meditation, and kind of like I said with the hypnosis stuff, a lot of what we see with meditation ends up being just sort of the idea of relaxing and getting control of your body. So with meditation, we can call these practices that train our attention to heighten awareness and bring mental processes under greater voluntary control. So whereas in hypnosis, you're sort of forced to relax and then listen to someone's commands, this would be more of the idea of you're bringing yourself to that relaxed state, and then you're focusing on different aspects of your consciousness, and by doing that, you can get a little bit more control over it. So this would be things like yoga, Zen, transcendental meditation. All of these have sort of potential psychological benefits, but a lot of this just goes over to the fact that you are relaxing and sort of calming your mind and sort of bringing your body back into balance. So it's not so much, again, that strange, unexplainable situation that people think of when they think of hypnosis or meditation. It's more just that sort of calming and grounding effect of forcing your mind to relax. When doing meditation, people focus their attention. Sometimes there are types of meditation that go with what's called open monitoring. So instead of directing your focus to one thing or another, most of them will get you to focus on your breathing or your heartbeat or something like that. Open monitoring would be sort of just being aware of everything around you. And that kind of decentralizes you, but also seems to have some similar effects. But the process of meditation and just being aware of things, and again, that term grounding, it seems to be beneficial, and it can be helpful for people who have, say, anxiety or things that need sort of training out. So things like cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, can involve a lot of overlap with meditation, where you focus in on you think about being in a situation that causes you anxiety, but focus in on the fact that you're still breathing, that you're still okay, that you're safe, and get yourself back to that point of balance. And that helps those situations in the future have less of an anxiety-inducing quality to them. So a much broader topic that could be discussed on its own, but I keep it very, very light here. Okay, so next I want to move on to altering consciousness with drugs. So the last of our fairly random assortment of topics for this chapter. So when we're talking about drugs, we're specifically talking about psychoactive drugs because we mostly care about how they influence consciousness. That's the chapter. So these psychoactive drugs are going to be chemicals that are fairly similar to those that naturally occur in our body. So we'll have neurotransmitters or hormones that these drugs can imitate. So they can act in a way as to either sort of enhance those hormones or neurotransmitters, replace them, or maybe nullify them. There's lots of different ways that this can happen. But these molecules, these drugs, are going to be altering our consciousness by changing the different chemical processes in our neurons. So if we think about back in chapter 3 when we were talking about those neurotransmitters that would act on sort of those postsynaptic neurons, and they would cause either more or less firing, whether they were excitatory or inhibitory. Well, these psychoactive drugs can do something very similar in a bunch of different ways. And of course, because it's a psychology class, we also want to be aware that it's not just a biological outcome. It's not just something that happens because of the chemical properties. There's also psychological and environmental and learned cultural effects on how we react to drugs. And we'll talk about some of those as time goes on. But when we're talking about these psychoactive drugs, we have two broad categories. We can have agonists or antagonists. And so agonists are drugs that increase the activity of a neurotransmitter. So they are going to enhance a neurotransmitter's action in some way, shape, or form. Now, I don't want you to confuse these with sort of a definition of it being either excitatory or inhibitory, because it can increase the activity of a neurotransmitter, but that neurotransmitter might be excitatory or inhibitory. So an agonist isn't necessarily one or the other. It really depends on which neurotransmitter it's working with. So if a drug is an agonist and it's increasing the activity of an inhibitory neurotransmitter, then we're going to see more inhibition and fewer neuronal firings. And then vice versa. If it's increasing the activity of an excitatory neurotransmitter, we see more firing. So a couple of the different ways that this can work is if the agonist increases the production or the storage or the release of a neurotransmitter that occurs naturally. So if we make more of it, then there's more of it present to be released into that synapse. If we tell it to store more after making more, then there's more available to be dumped into the synapse. Or releasing more of what's already there, it might deplete our stores, but it also causes an increase in effect for a short time. It might also work on that postsynaptic neuron though. It might activate that receptor itself. So maybe it doesn't even have to involve the neurotransmitter. Maybe it just takes the place of it. So maybe it's a drug that has a receptor or has a piece that fits into the same receptor as that neurotransmitter. So it could itself activate that receptor. Or it could bind somewhere nearby and make that receptor more sensitive to the neurotransmitter. So making it more likely for that neurotransmitter to bind and then do whatever it's going to do. And then the last way that it can sort of increase the activity of these neurotransmitters is by preventing the removal or sort of breakdown of that neurotransmitter. So we had talked about that stage of reuptake, where the cell would either sort of go over and clean up all those neurotransmitters to reuse or break them down to be converted into something else. They could interfere with this process. So if you think about it, a neurotransmitter has bound to that receptor and something is supposed to come along and scoop it out so that it can be recycled. But that thing that does the scooping is held up somewhere, or it's occupied somewhere else, or it's broken down. So you can't get rid of that neurotransmitter, so it keeps sending that same signal. So we can have a persistent signal long after it should have been there. And then, as you might guess, for antagonists, they're going to act in the opposite direction. So they're going to inhibit or decrease the activity of a neurotransmitter. And so again, if we think about the fact that we can have excitatory or inhibitory neurotransmitters, we are making those less effective. So if you decrease the activity of an inhibitory neurotransmitter, you end up increasing the odds of firing. So this is one of those where when I'm trying to remember these topics, I like drawing little arrows. So if we're increasing the activity of something that decreases, we're ending up making it more negative. and things like that, because there's a lot of increases and decreases here in these concepts. And I do like to ask at least one of those questions when it comes to tests. And then if we wanted to think of the practicality of how an antagonist might function, it might decrease the production, storage, or release. So same idea, just don't make as much of the neurotransmitter, don't store as much of it, or don't release as much of it. And another option is it might prevent that neurotransmitter from binding to the postsynaptic receptor. So on that postsynaptic neuron, instead of binding and activating that receptor, it might bind to that receptor in order to block that site. Maybe it binds but doesn't interact, it just sort of plugs the hole so that nothing can attach there. So that would be preventing its activation. Or maybe it binds somewhere nearby and it changes the shape of that receptor or the polarity or something like that. So there's lots of different ways, but our big categories of how these act are sort of a nice way to visualize what's going on. All right. And so when we talk about drug use, we usually have a couple of terms that come up fairly often. So we're going to talk a little bit about tolerance and withdrawal and a bunch of those other important terms. But tolerance is basically a decreasing responsiveness to a drug over time. So if you, I guess a good example of this is maybe you just start drinking. You haven't had alcohol before, and maybe you go out with some friends and you have a beer. And after one beer, you're feeling a little bit lightheaded. And a couple weeks go by and you continue going out with friends after class, you keep having one beer, but then you find that you don't feel lightheaded at all. So maybe now you can have 2 before you feel lightheaded, and then 3. That would be building up tolerance to that substance. And alcohol counts as a drug because it interacts with stuff in our body. So you've developed a tolerance, and the reason for this is because our body is always trying to maintain balance. And so we've used the term homeostasis before, talking about our body trying to maintain its natural balance point. And this can apply to lots of different things. This can be temperature, this can be amount of alcohol in the system, this can be pH in the blood, all sorts of things. Our body wants to be balanced all the time. And so when we consume a drug, it's going to shift us outside of that balance point. So if we think about alcohol, which happens to be a depressant, it's going to reduce activity in our central nervous system. And we'll talk about depressants in a couple of slides. But our body doesn't want to have reduced activity in our central nervous system. So it's going to try and ramp things up to get us back to normal. And so what tolerance is basically the body has gotten used to the fact that, oh, when we have this substance, everything does this and I don't want it to, so I'm going to push back up again to get us back to normal. So it's a sort of competing force acting in the opposite direction of what the drug's effects are. And then what happens is your body gets used to that particular amount of responding. So maybe I guess a good example of this is coffee, because coffee has a pretty intense withdrawal occurrence, or specifically the caffeine in coffee. But so you get used to waking up in the morning and having a cup of coffee, and then maybe it's midterm season, so now you start having 2 or 3, and before you know it, you have a whole pot of coffee before you start your day. And so you'd like to stop that. You'd like to go back to maybe 1 cup a day. So if you stop drinking that large amount of coffee, your body has gotten used to compensating for lots and lots of coffee in your system. And so it's prepared to act against coffee, but there's no coffee to act against. So if the coffee was pushing you sort of one way and your body was pushing the other way, those arrows used to be equal. So it used to be an equal push and they met in the middle, so you were at that balance state. But now the arrow or the push from the coffee is much, much less, but the body hasn't figured that out yet. So it's going to push a whole lot more. And so you're going to end up with these really awful feelings in the opposite direction of what coffee was doing. So if caffeine helps raise your heart rate and make you alert, then maybe you're going to have a really slow heart rate. You're going to be really tired. And that's because your body was trying to help, but went too far. And so those symptoms, that feeling in the opposite direction of what the drug was doing for you, are withdrawal symptoms. And so I guess we can say the stuff that's on the slide, but this is the occurrence of those compensatory responses that occur after you stop using a drug. So compensatory responses are just responses that compensate for the action of the drug, so in the opposite direction. So strong reactions in the opposite direction of what the drug was doing. So when we start talking about different categories like stimulants that increase the central nervous system function and depressants that reduce the central nervous system function, these withdrawal symptoms would be in the opposite direction. All right, and the next topic is actually something that I find really, really interesting, and this is the idea of learning and tolerance, where we bring back the idea that it isn't just a biological occurrence, there's also some psychology going on here as well. And so it always makes me sad that we do this right before we cover the chapter on learning. So we talk about classical conditioning in very loose terms here, but we cover it in tons of detail in the next chapter. But there isn't a nice way to fit these together without having at least one topic out of order. So this will make a little bit more sense after our next chapter, so maybe we'll revisit it then. But the idea here is that when we're using different drugs, so let's go back to the alcohol example. So every Wednesday after class, you go out with friends to a local pub, and you have a couple of drinks. And you find that, you started with 1 beer, now you have 3, and you feel a little bit of a buzz, but not too bad, just enough that you can walk home safely. So you've developed that response to drinking, and your body gets you to homeostasis pretty good, you're at a good point. A lot of what our body learns about isn't necessarily in direct response to consuming the alcohol. What we've actually found is that when you walk into that bar, or when you walk into that pub, your body goes, I know this place, this is the place that we drink, so I'm going to get ready to drink alcohol. And so you might actually find that you feel kind of gross right before you start drinking, and it's because your body has already started those compensatory responses, not in response to the drug, but in response to the environment. And so that's happened because you've been classically conditioned to expect a particular occurrence in a particular environment. So when we think of classical conditioning, we usually think of Pavlov and his dogs, where ringing a bell, they start salivating. Same basic idea, but for you, ringing the bell is walking into a pub. And the salivating is just your body producing a response to, counteracting what we would be feeling from an alcoholic effect. And then this becomes problematic if, say, the pub is closed. They have a special event one week and they're closed to business, so you're going to have to go somewhere else. So maybe you walk a little bit further up the street, you find a new place. You sit down, you order 3 beer at the beginning of the night because that's what you're going to need, and you get maybe 2 beer in and you start feeling really, really sick. Well, because you're in a new environment, your body didn't sort of pre-prepare for alcohol. So you can actually lose your tolerance because your body didn't advance prepare to push in the other direction. And so instead, you only get the direct response to the physical effects, but you don't get any of that environmental preparation. And so what happens is if you drink somewhere where you're not used to drinking, you can get drunk a lot faster and you can feel a lot worse. And in fact, a lot of overdoses with drug users happen because they're using in a new location. It's something like 60% of overdoses are just because they've used in a location they've never used before. So you can take the exact same amount, but the effect is so much stronger because those compensatory responses are a lot weaker when your body doesn't preemptively activate them. So that's how we end up with a lot of potential problems with new environments. And then there's just a visual here in case that wasn't quite making sense for how tolerance works. But it talks about sort of taking a drug the first time your body starts compensating to sort of that physical action of it. Repeatedly taking a drug in a particular setting leads to compensatory responses to that setting and not just to the presence of the drug in your body. And so now the setting alone will produce those conditioned compensatory responses. So it's something you've learned. And then if you take the same dose of the drug in a new setting, those compensatory responses are not at full strength because you're not reacting to the environment, you're just physically reacting to the drug.
About the compensating based on your environment, do you need to have the, or does it matter to have the intention of changing the environment, or does it have to be like a change that's happening randomly, like something happened that causes you to have control over?
That's sort of one of those things where we have to pick it out or pick it apart a lot with research. I think it's more about sort of, it's an unconscious thing. Like I describe it as your body knows what's going on, but it's not sentient. It's not doing that intentionally. So it's sort of like an automatic response. And it'd be really interesting to see, like, maybe you always drink at a, I don't know, I can't think of a thing that's been around, Kelsey's. I don't even think those exist anymore, but you always go to that particular place. And then you go to another one and it's the same chain but a different restaurant, but it looks the same. Does that still work? I don't actually know. I don't know how much of like the location gets tied into it, and I don't know how much the intention gets tied into it. But yeah, it's a really interesting concept, and I very much would like to learn more about it.
So with classical conditioning occur with also like medical drugs as well, so like help with hormones and stuff?
A little bit, yeah. Depends on like the functionality of them. So if it's something that our body doesn't compensate against, then it won't have a compensatory response to produce. But if it's something where you're encouraging it to sort of react in a particular way, then yeah, it should be pretty universal. We only really talk about it in terms of like psychoactive drugs because of that sort of push and pull that we end up with. But yeah, there's no reason why it shouldn't work on everything. All right. How are we doing? It might be a little short today, but I hope you guys don't mind. So for our last bit here, I've kind of hinted at some of our categories of drugs, and our chapter has done a fantastic job of giving us this really nice diagram here. And so I'm going to talk about this diagram just a little bit before we hop back to the previous slide. But this is the kind of information that I find some textbooks love going into and then love making questions about. So they would ask you about sort of all of those types of narcotics. So can you remember that morphine and heroin and oxycodone are all narcotics and that they're all going to do pain relief and all of that sort of thing? And I really don't love those kinds of questions, which is why I structure this chapter the way I do. I actually have slides where we break down sort of each of the specific types of drugs and everything, but I was getting them ready and it was like, I don't like these questions anyways, so you guys have enough stuff to learn. What I focus on instead are those big categories. So narcotics would be a category. Sedatives would be a category. And then I would like you to be able to know some of the desired effects and sort of what happens if it goes wrong, but not to the same level as what the textbook does, because there are so many pages on this. And this doesn't come up again in this course, so I've decided to do some chopping here. So that's why that chart is there. It also tells you that it's table 5.4 if you want the bigger version from the textbook. But that's all the stuff that you could know that I don't really care so much about. So if we wanted to talk about our broad category of narcotics or opiates, those are the ones that are really important for pain relief. And I guess we can kind of come back here. So they are commonly abused because of those pain relieving properties. So morphine, heroin, oxycodone, those are all things that you've probably heard about as being problem drugs, especially on the streets. So the things that people are aiming for are the relaxation, euphoria, and pain relief. So feeling good because you're blocking signals of pain, which even if you're not in extreme pain can feel good because then there's not any of those bad feelings from anywhere, which you can imagine might be why it's an addictive quality. For our sedatives, I'm going to kind of keep hopping back and forth. I think they're all the same information. Sleep-inducing. So as you can kind of imagine here, sedatives are basically your sleeping pills, things that help you relax and calm down. Barbiturates and non-barbiturates, so real good categories there. But Mostly we talk about barbiturates because those are going to be like sleeping pills, things that help you relax. They can reduce anxiety, reduce your inhibitions because they're slowing everything down for you. Again, can come with a little bit of euphoria, which you'll find is fairly common in a lot of drugs that end up being addictive. With stimulants, we've already kind of hinted at these. Stimulants and depressants as sort of two sides of the same coin. So stimulants are those that ramp up your nervous system, so they're going to increase activity. We can talk about things like amphetamines and cocaine, and they can be helpful to treat things like hyperactivity, so ADHD. There are some things that would fall in here. Some of them can be used as anesthetics. That's what cocaine was originally developed for. In the past, when I've done a lot more detail on cocaine, we've discussed the fact that it was originally heralded as one of those really big sort of game-changing drugs that was going to make everything better. They sold it in everything from cough medicine to like Coca-Cola. And so they loved it because it had all of these great properties like suppressing coughing. And the reason why it did that, it suppressed coughing by suppressing activity in the brain. So it was a little bit intense, and a couple years later when they figured out the detrimental side effects, they pulled back on it. But it was for quite some time in quite a few over-the-counter products, including like sleep aids and things like that, which was kind of terrifying. But for what most people are using it for is sort of those boosting feelings, getting rid of fatigue, feeling energized and excited, increased alertness, basically just ramping up that central nervous system. And then our depressants went the other way. They kind of pushed everything down. So depressants, does it have its own category on here? It does not. So our depressants would be things like alcohol would fall under depressants. Actually, our sedatives would as well. But it happens because it's sort of reducing that central nervous system functioning. I always find it interesting to tell people that alcohol is a depressant because when you think of people who drink, there's usually that rambunctious phase where they have reduced inhibitions and they're more outgoing and all of these things that don't seem to be sort of that calming and sedating property. But in fact, what's going on is that alcohol first acts on the parts of our brain that are involved in sort of making decisions and sort of making calculations about interacting with people. So we depress that reduction in activity. So what happens first is that we are more active because we've lost our inhibitions. And then as time goes on, then some people get tired, it can start feeling harder to breathe and things like that. And that's because it's then going into depression in sort of deeper areas of the brain. But it's always interesting to point that out. We can have hallucinogens, and these, you'll sometimes see them called different things, sometimes hallucinogens, sometimes psychedelics, depending on what they focus in on. And these are known for distorting our sensory and perceptual experience. So again, if we hop to our slides here, that would be things like LSD and mushrooms. So I don't agree that there are no medical uses that they talk about. There are some cases, I guess more recently, so the textbook might not be caught up, but low levels of some of them can be used to treat anxiety, just because it helps sort of rewire the way your brain is functioning, but I think that is a far more recent occurrence. The desired effects is that increased sensory awareness. Usually people feel good. It's altering perceptions. These are typically taken in order to experience things and feel sort of grandiose and more connected. But of course, it can always go in the opposite direction. And then cannabis ends up being in its own category, and this is another one of those weird ones that I always take a moment to talk about, and it's because nobody really seems to agree on where it should be categorized. It has qualities that overlap with the hallucinogens because it modifies perception, things like slowing down our perception of time and making us feel calmer. So that's its own thing. Most textbooks, at least the ones that I like, end up focusing in on the fact that it fits in its own category. And if you start reading the textbooks, you find that a lot of them aren't quite sure how to handle it now, because the older textbooks talked about it being one of the most widely used illegal drugs, but now it's been legalized in Canada, and I believe it's legal in 11 different states. At least that's what one of my other texts has said. So there's this sort of swing in people's view of it. And there's a growing support behind legalization. I saw an interesting statistic that said in the last decade, they've had almost a 3 times increase in support for legalization, which is quite a large jump. So we're getting lots and lots more research, especially now that it's been legalized. So I'm sure all of our literature will be changing as we start learning more about it. But yeah, again, I don't go into too much detail on that. And let's see if I missed anything else. Yeah, I think that was it. I didn't want to go into too much detail on those, as I said. So I will leave you guys with that. For the exam, don't worry too much about details. Don't worry about specific drugs. Focus on broad categories. And if I do mention that I'm talking about alcohol, I'll also mention that it is also a depressant, so that you have some context to put it in.